Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we are deploying a Django and React application on Microsoft Azure. This is not the first video in this tutorial series. In the previous video I've already given an explanation on the architecture of this deployment, which also includes prerequisites and the way that we're going to deploy our application on the Microsoft Azure cloud. In the next videos we're going to publish our code to GitHub using Git, deploy our Django and React code to Azure, and talk about the cost of deployment and troubleshooting. But before we can actually do that, we need to make some changes to our Django backend code to make sure that it is actually ready for the deployment. And if we take a look at the architecture view of the previous video, we're actually focused on the top left of the image, where we're going to modify our local code so that it is ready for the deployment. And in this video, we're going to be following 6 main steps. We're going to be starting with installing some additional packages for our deployment, since hosting our application on Microsoft Azure requests some different things than hosting the code on our local computer. Next, we're going to be creating a settings file for our deployment, because also there it's going to be a little bit different than our local settings. And we're going to tell our application when to use our deployment settings and when to use our local settings. We're also going to add a requirements.txt file, which will list down all of the different packages that we have used. And we're going to add a config and a git ignore file, which is going to provide some information for the deployment. And as the last step, we're going to be changing some of the settings to environment variables to make sure that the code that we push to GitHub is 100% secure. So let's get started. And the first step that we need to take is installing some additional packages, because the way that our app is going to run on the Azure portal is going to be a little bit different than how we run it locally. And we are going to need some additional packages to make sure that it all works. And the first additional package that we will install is psycopg2. On our local project, we are using a SQLite database, and Django can communicate with that perfectly. However, during production on Azure, we will be using a PostgreSQL database. And for Django to communicate with that database, we need an additional package called psycopg2. So I'm going to copy over this command, go back to our code, and we're going to be starting by cding into our backend folder, because that's where I want to install it. And I'm also going to activate my virtual environment with vim scripts/activate. And after that's done, I'm going to do python -m. And after that, I put in the statement pip install psycopg2. And let's give that some time to install. The next package that we will need is white noise. And white noise is going to handle the static files when we are on Microsoft Azure. And same as before, I'm going to copy over this command and go back to our local code. And in there, we specify python -m and then pip install white noise. And our installs are complete. And these are actually the only 2 packages that we will need to make sure that everything works on Azure. The next thing that we're going to do is create a separate settings.py file for when we are in production. Because in our current settings.py file, you will see some things that do not apply when we go to the Azure portal. And one of these examples is the database that is set to using a SQLite database. But when we go to production, we want to tell our code to use the PostgreSQL database. So we will need to create a file where we're going to highlight the differences between these settings and our deployment settings. And to do that, inside of the same folder where our settings.py file is located, I'm going to create a new file called deployment.py. And in here, we're going to define all of the settings that are different opposed to the settings.py file. So if the settings are in here and not in our deployment.py file, it's still going to look back and use those settings. And on top of the deployment.py file, we're going to start with some imports. And the first one is import OS. The next is from.settings import and then an asterisk, which is going to function as all. And then separately from.settings, we're going to import base dir, because for some reason it will not work if you just do the asterisk. The first setting that's going to be different in deployment opposed to our settings.py file is going to be the allowed hosts. And when we go to the Django documentation, you can see that the allowed host presents the host and domain names that the Django site can serve. So this is a security measure to prevent different attacks. Now, in this case, we only want to specify the URL of our backend because that's the only URL that this code is allowed to serve. At this moment, we don't know that URL yet, but what I do know is that when we deploy our code to Azure, Microsoft is going to generate an environment variable that contains the URL of our backend application. So we can just use that one to put in the allowed host variable. So in here, we're going to specify os.environ and then square brackets, and we will specify website underscore host name in capitals. And this is going to make sure that that URL is listed right there. The next setting that we need to change is the CSRF trusted origins, like this. And the CSRF trusted origins is a list that can make unsafe requests, so post requests and those kind of things. And here goes the same thing. The only trusted origins that can make these kind of requests to our database should be our backend. So in here, it's actually going to be exactly the same as the value for the allowed hosts, but we need to create a small prefix because we also need to include the HTTPS string in front of this. So what I will do is I will open some parentheses and then do a plus sign like this. And then inside of these parentheses, we specify HTTPS and then a colon and then 2 slashes. And that will make a complete web address with the URL that is specified in the environment variables. The next setting that we're going to change is debug. And if you go to your current settings.py file and you scroll all the way up, you will see that in your settings, your debug is set to true. And it also states that it has a security warning that we don't want to run with debug turned on in production. So to make sure that that is off, we need to specify debug is equal to false. The next thing that will be different is the middleware. And in our settings.py file, middleware has already been defined, and we're going to add a small line in there to handle the static files with white noise. So in our settings.py file, I'm going to copy over this complete string of middleware and paste it in our deployment.py file. And underneath the security middleware, I'm going to add a new line. And in there, I'm going to list that down as white noise dot middleware dot white noise middleware, and then end it with a comma. And the first two, white noise and middleware, are going to be lowercase, and then in the last one, white noise and middleware will all be in capitals. And make sure that you spell this right, otherwise you will get an error. Another thing that will be changed opposed to our current setting is the course allowed origins. Because in our settings.py file, you can see that we allow requests from our localhost 3000, which is the web address of our frontend. However, when we're going to run on the Azure portal, the address of our frontend is going to be different, and we don't really know that yet. So I'm going to copy over the course allowed origins setting and paste it inside of our deployment.py file. I'm going to remove the localhost 3000. And I'm just going to comment this one out because we will come back to this one once we know the URL of our frontend, which will be in one of the next videos. The next setting that we will need to set has to do with the handling of the white noise files for compression and caching support. So what you usually do in Django is you define the static files storage variable and you add the string provided by white noise. However, if you use Django 4.2 or higher, it wants you to use the new variable called storages, and in there define the white noise storage. If you are running Django on Django 4.1 or lower, please make sure to use the static files storage variable like this and add the string here provided by white noise. If you run on Django 4.2 or higher, please use the storages variable. And in my case, I am on Django 4.2.5, so I will need to be using the storages variable. So on the Django documentation, you can see what the default value is right here. So I'm just going to copy over this default and put it inside of our settings. So storages, is going to be equal to a default for the backend and a default for the static files. And then I'm going to go back to the white noise documentation and I'm going to look what string I need to put in here. You can see that as the default, it sets the white noise.storage.compressed manifest static files storage. However, I tried it with this particular setting on and I did not get it to work properly. However, when I use this one, the white noise.storage.compressed static files storage, so without the manifest part, it worked perfectly. And in general, inside of our Django application, we will not be handling a lot of different static files, so it will be good regardless. But just to make it work correctly, I would advise you to use this setting right here. So I'm going to copy that over and I'm going to change the backend string that is defined as the Django string to white noise.storage in lowercase and then .compressed static files storage and all of those higher case. And if you want to check how I did certain things, you can always go to my GitHub repository and take a look at the code yourself. The next thing that we need to change are our database settings because locally we use the SQLite configuration as described in the documentation. But when we go to the deployment, we're going to be using the PostgreSQL setup. And that one is also listed down in the documentation. I'm just going to copy over this configuration from the Django documentation and paste it underneath the storages. And I'm going to make a few small changes. We don't need to supply the port in this case because that is going to be arranged by default. I'm going to put the host underneath the name because that is kind of how I always have it set up like this. All right. And now we need to replace the name, the host, the user, and the password with the credentials that we will receive from Azure. And similar as the allowed host variable, Azure is going to define an environment variable that has the credentials in there for our database. So let's put in that connection string. So above the database, I'm going to define a new variable called connection. And in there we specify os.environ, square brackets, and then Azure underscore PostgreSQL underscore connection string. And this will contain all of the credentials that we need to pass inside of our databases variable. Now, unfortunately, we do need to make a small change to this connection string before we can pass it to these different variables. And to do that, I'm going to create a new variable called connection underscore str. And I'm going to define an isString and define a function that is going to slightly change this connection string like this. And I did not think of this myself. This is actually listed in the Microsoft example for deploying a Django application. And I just copied it over from there. So we're going to start with some squarely brackets, and then we're going to say pair.split, and we're going to open some round brackets, and in there we do two parentheses and an is sign. And after those round brackets, we will define some square brackets with a 0 to highlight that this is going to be applied to the first pair that we encounter. After that, we do a colon and we do pair.split. And we're going to do exactly the same with the round brackets, parentheses, and an is sign. And after that, we're going to do the square brackets, but this time we do a 1 because we want to change the second one in that list. And after that, we say for pair in connection dot split. And in that split, we just define the parentheses with a space and nothing else right there. So it needs to be defined like this. This can be quite complicated, so feel free to just go to my GitHub repository and copy over this setting so you know that it will be done correctly. Now we can pass in this adjusted connection string into the credential setting of our database. Now the engine is already defined correctly. And for the name, we're going to replace this my database with connection string and then square brackets. And we're going to look for DB name because that is the value that we want to get out of it. We're going to do the same for the host, but we're going to change DB name to host. And the same for user and password, but in there we need to define it, of course, as user right here and as password inside of the password variable. And let's save this. And just like that, now our database should be set up correctly. The last thing that we're also going to define is a static root. And the static root is going to be the place where a command that we're going to run later is going to put all of the different static files in our application so that white noise can find them during our deployment. And we're going to define this as base dir and then a slash and then two parentheses and static files. And when we run that command, it's going to get all of the static files from our application and it's going to put them in a folder called static files inside of our base directory, which means that it will just create a new folder inside of the backend folder called static files, and it will just copy and paste over all of the files in there. And this is actually the last setting that we need to change to be ready for the production. So we have now successfully defined our deployment settings, but we still need to tell our application when to use our local settings and when to use the settings for when we are in the deployment. And we need to do that in two different files. The first one is in the wsgi.py file, because you can see in here on the top that is going to set the default Django settings module equal to our local settings file. But in here, we actually want to define the correct settings based on whether we are on our local computer or whether we are on the Azure portal. And we can do that by adding a new variable called settings module. And in there, we're going to say that we want to use crud.deployment, which is the settings file that we've just created specifically for our deployment, if website underscore hostname in os.environ, and if that is not the case, then we want to use our crud.settings file. And what does this piece of code do? Well, we already saw in the allowed host variable in the deployment.py file that Azure is going to generate an environment variable called website.hostname. And what we do in here is we say if we see this website.hostname variable in the environment variables, then we know that we are on the Azure portal. So if that's the case, then we want to use our deployment settings. But if that is not the case, we just want to use the local settings in our project and make sure that everything works for our local computer. So based on this conditional statement, our Django application will use the correct settings in the correct environment. And now all we need to do is use this setting modules and put it in the place where crud.settings was, and now it's going to define those correct settings for us. The next file where we also need to make this change is in the manage.py file, because you can see here in the 9th row like this, that it's doing the same thing as in the wsgi.py file. It's setting the default settings based on the crud.settings file. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the wsgi file and we're going to copy over the statement for settings module and the os.environment.setDefault. And we're going to paste that in our manage.py file, like this. And by doing this, everything should work correctly. The next thing that we're going to do is creating a requirements.txt file. And a requirements.txt file is a list of all of the packages that we've used during development, including the version that we used. Because Azure will also need to install those packages on the server to make sure that our app will run correctly. And generating that requirements.txt file is actually incredibly easy. You can go to your command line and make sure that you are in your backend folder and that you also have your virtual environment on if you have that. And you can specify python-m pip freeze a bigger than sign and then requirements.txt. And when you click on enter, you will see that inside of your backend folder, a new file called requirements.txt appears. And inside of that folder, you will find all of the packages that you used during the development. So in my case, I of course see Django, but I also see the packages that we've just installed called psycopg2 and white noise. And by adding this in the top layer of our application, Microsoft is going to know that it needs to install those for us inside of the environment on Azure. The next files that we need to add is a .production file and a git ignore file. And let's get started with the .production file. In the backend folder on the highest level, you're going to add a file called .production. And on the top there, you're going to add some square brackets and do config, because we're going to set one configuration variable that is going to be used by Azure when doing the deployment of our application. And that variable is going to be scm underscore do underscore build underscore during underscore deployment. And we're going to set that equal to true. And just make sure that you add the D right here. So it's scm do build during deployment. And what this is going to do is going to tell Azure that every time that we push our code to Azure, it actually needs to build our application. And if you do not specify this particular setting, it is not going to do that and it is not going to work. So this one is very important to set inside of your code. The next file that we will also add is a .gitignore file. And your .gitignore file is nothing more than a list of the files that we want to exclude from our deployment. In the next video, we're going to bring this project from our local computer to GitHub using Git, but we don't need all of the files that are currently in our directory. For example, we have a file in here called SQLite3, which is our database that we use for local development. But we will not need that when we deploy our application, so it's best to just leave it out. Another example is that in all of these files you will have a bycache with kind of different files with different parts of information. And you don't want to bring those to your deployment because it can actually mess up some of the things that you do. So it's always good to add a gitignore file and specify a list of items in there that you don't want to take to GitHub or use during your deployment. Now I've actually done a deployment to Azure with Django before, and in there I already created a .gitignore file, and this is completely based on Microsoft documentation because it was also included in their example. So I'm just going to copy over all of the lines inside of this document. Not all of them are going to be relevant for your project, but it does include the main stuff for Django and also some other packages. So just copy over everything that is in there, and I'm going to paste it inside of our .gitignore file. I would recommend you to just go to my GitHub repository and go to this file and just copy and paste everything that I have inside of your file, because that's going to make sure that it's going to work. You can already see some of the things that I mentioned before, such as the bycache being included here, and also if we scroll down, the SQLite database. Alright, so with those two files added, I think there's one small change that we need to make in our deployment.py file. Because in our current settings file, you can see that we have a secret key defined. And it actually mentions with the security warning, keep this secret key used in production as a secret. But right now it is defined in our settings.py file, and if it is not in a deployment.py file, it's just going to use this value right here. So to circumvent that and make sure that everything works the way that we expect, I'm going to go after the debug setting inside of our deployment.py file, and I'm going to define the secret key, and I'm going to set that to os.environ and then square brackets and then my secret key. And in one of the next videos, when we set up all of our Azure resources, I'm going to manually set an environment variable in the Azure portal called mySecretKey. I'm going to add a secret string to that, so it is set in our Azure portal and not visible to our code. And that is going to make sure that the secret key is safe when we go to the deployment. So we've now done all of the changes that we need to do to our Django code to make it ready for the deployment. The last thing that is important to check is if our code is still running correctly on our local computer. So to check that, I'm going to just start up the server using python manage.py run server. And you can see that our server is indeed starting in the same way, and it's using the crud.settings settings, so that is actually working fine. And also when I open the link, you can see that we get to our API root and everything is working the way that we expect. So it seems like our code is now ready for the deployment. And that is actually all that we will be doing today. Today we've successfully modified our Django backend code to make sure that it is ready for deployment. In the next videos, we're going to push our code to GitHub using Git, and we're going to deploy our Django backend and our React.js frontend code to Microsoft Azure. And as a last video, I'm also going to tell you a little bit more about the costs of this deployment and also how you can troubleshoot when things go wrong. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.